So let's get into chapter 12. And I apologize, my video is not working. When I turn it on, it's just a black screen. So for this um, presentation, you won't see the video, but hopefully that's okay. So of course, we're going to be talking about mental health, psychological disorders. So I just wanted to put this information here in case anyone is in need of it. We do have mental health services at Sacramento State that are available to you as a student for free. Okay, they are included in your tuition. You do pay for them, but you can go to the there's the student health and counseling services. They are still having appointments even through COVID, and they do have Zoom or online options as well. So I've posted their hours there. They're open Monday through Friday from 8:30 to 4 p.m. I've posted their phone number as well as a link to their website if you need any of their services. All right, so let's talk about defining abnormal behavior. So think about how you would define abnormal behavior and how you know or determine that behavior is actually abnormal. So you can pause the video or just kind of think about that to yourselves a little bit. But if you really think about various behaviors that you may have engaged in yourself or seen other people engage in, it is actually quite difficult to pin down what is normal versus what is considered abnormal. And I think if we were to sit in a room and everyone was to give a definition of what abnormal behavior is, we'd probably have as many different definitions as there were people in the room. Because what might be normal for you might be considered abnormal for someone else. So, we're going to talk a lot about in this chapter those various measures that we use to help determine what is normal and abnormal. But there's always an exception to the measures because, as I mentioned, what is normal to you is different for what is considered normal to someone else. So, when we are defining abnormal behavior scientifically or in psychology, abnormal behavior is behavior that causes people to experience some sort of distress and prevents them from functioning in their daily lives, or I would say successfully functioning in their daily lives. And a psychological disorder is the presence of some concentration of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral symptoms that create significant distress and significant impairment with work, school, family relationships, or daily living. So that means there's significant impairment. They cannot function in any of those capacities at work or in relationships with their daily living. And these can often lead to significant risk of harm of the individual, of themselves, or even to others. The most widely accepted definition is used in the DSM-5. So, this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is where all of the mental disorders that are known to the medical community are considered to be a mental disorder. They are all listed here, and definitions for those, symptoms of each of those disorders and dysfunctions um, are all defined in the DSM-5. And that is the most widely accepted measure, and that is typically what is used in the medical community. So, how do we define abnormal behavior? What measures do we have when we're looking at a behavior to say, okay, here's the checklist, and how do we determine whether this behavior is normal or not? So, we have the statistical deviation from the norm. So, this is statistically speaking, right? We're looking at averages of certain behaviors and determining where the behavior falls on the spectrum of an average behavior. So we'll talk about that more in depth in a bit. Distress, so whether or not the individual experiences distress and impairment. So, is this impacting their daily life to the point where they can no longer successfully function? Okay, so they can't hold a job, or they can't go to work, they can't maintain successful relationships, they cannot maintain family relationships, right? So, they can't function within their family unit, and so on and so forth. Are they a danger to their self or others? So, are the behaviors that they're engaging in causing harm to them as the individual, or is the behavior causing harm to others? And we also need to look at whether the behavior fits with the individual's cultural and social influences. So, in one culture, a behavior might be considered abnormal, but in another culture, it may not. Okay, and we'll talk about some examples of those a little bit later on when we talk about cultural influences and abnormal behavior. But it is something that we have to take into account. We have to look at cultural norms. Because although we may observe a behavior and say, well, that is an abnormal behavior, within the culture of that individual, that may not be the case. Okay, so first, statistical deviations from the normal, statistical deviations of behavior. So behavior is considered to be abnormal if its occurrence is statistically infrequent, which means behaviors we would define as normal are going to occur at the center of the distribution at high rates, right? So we see many individuals engaging in many instances of these quote unquote normal behaviors, whereas abnormal behaviors are going to deviate from this norm. So when you're looking at a distribution like this of normal to abnormal behavior, we have normal behavior occurring at zero. So, right there in the center of the distribution, and you see it occurring at the highest rates, right? So, when we see a lot of people engaging in this behavior, a lot of the time it's considered a normal behavior. Okay, and it's at the center of the distribution there. So, the further the behavior is from the norm, or the further it is out from the center of the distribution, the less frequently you're going to see that behavior. You'll see fewer people engaging in that behavior. So now we're talking about a few individuals engaging in behaviors that most people do not engage in. So they're occurring at very infrequent or low numbers. These are the abnormal behaviors. So the further away you get from the center, that normal distribution, we would say, the more abnormal the behavior is. And we see, those higher abnormal behaviors occurring at much lower rates, right? Because most people do not engage in those behaviors. So let's look at some advantages and disadvantages of using this method. So using the statistical deviation from the norm. So the first advantage is that the cutoff points, okay, so where we're determining what is normal versus what is abnormal, those are quantitative, right? So we can numerically measure or assign value to where the cutoff points occur. So where does normal behavior occur, or what average is there of normal behavior versus what we're measuring or what the average is, at what point it becomes abnormal behavior. So we can quantify that numerically. But this leads to the first disadvantage of this method, which is that there are actually very few guidelines for establishing those cutoff scores. So, yes, we can quantify behavior in this way, but how do you decide the actual number that a behavior goes from normal to abnormal? Okay, so that's a disadvantage there. There really are few guidelines for determining that specific number. A second advantage is that the social norms may seem more obvious and are thus used for determining norms, right? So we would sort of look at our social norms and say, okay, that's socially acceptable. We're going to use that as quote unquote the measure for normal behavior, right? But again, this leads to the second disadvantage. There are a number of deviations in social behavior and what is considered to be normal. even in our own culture. So even if you're looking within the same culture, if you go from family unit to family unit, you might have different behaviors. Um, you see that in movies all the time, right? Where one next door neighbor is watching the other family next door and they're like, gosh, they do the weirdest things, they eat the strangest food. They, cut their grass at night when it's dark. They'll pick out these behaviors that are different from their own family unit, right? And categorize those as abnormal, right? Because they're not normal to them. So you can see that there can be, numerous deviations as to what is considered a social norm. Now, we do have, some behaviors that have been established by society as a whole, but there are many, many behaviors that are not, right? And they deviate quite widely, even just from family unit to family unit. So that is a disadvantage of that, is that although social norms may seem obvious, there are still many deviations that we would have to account for. Another disadvantage, of course, is we need to look at cultural relativity. So, this is the same thing, right? There's a number of deviations um, that can occur within a culture. And this is the biggest area of deviation of behaviors when we're looking at norm or a level of norm or a measure of normal behavior to abnormal behavior. You're going to see the biggest deviation and wide range of maybe defining what is abnormal versus normal within a culture. Okay. So it is really important to take into account the culture that individual comes from. So, for example, a thumbs up in our culture means everything's good. You're usually signaling to someone that everything's okay. But in other cultures, a thumbs up is actually a very disrespectful sign. And actually, it is almost, sort of like cursing at someone, like we would consider cursing at someone in our culture. So, a very simple behavior, right, that we would say, oh, totally normal. Another culture would say, no, that's not normal. You don't do that. So, that's just a very simple example. But there are many, many behaviors that deviate greatly within cultural practices. And the final disadvantage is that this method for defining abnormal behavior assumes that there's an ideal average individual that exists, right? So if we have this statistical deviation from the norm, we're saying that there are individuals that are at that perfect normal point. And we know that's not true, right? There isn't anyone who only engages in quote unquote normal behavior. Everyone engages in kind of strange behaviors from time to time. Not any one person only engages in normal and not abnormal behavior. The question is more how often do they engage in those abnormal behaviors, right? But there isn't an individual, which, if when you're looking at a statistical deviation or a distribution of behavior, that is assuming that there's a perfect norm. And when we're talking about human behavior, we don't see that. Okay. Now, another measure we had mentioned of abnormal behavior, of course, is whether the individual is experiencing some level of distress. So, often people who have some psychological disorder, they will display distress at some level. Now, this may be observable to others. So, this is where you can physically see someone else engaging in behaviors that indicate they're under some sort of stress. So, if they repeatedly burst into tears, they're sort of always talking about being hopeless, or having sort of like a down view of the world. And we're not just talking about like, an every now and then Debbie Downer. We're talking about someone who truly only sees the worst in everything. They cannot see the positive in anything. They sort of get stuck in their own feelings of distress, and they cannot see beyond that, right? So those are observable behaviors, but there are other behaviors that may be causing the individual distress that may not be observable at all. So things like anxiety or being worried about things, you cannot always observe those behaviors in someone else. Sometimes you can tell when someone's anxious or nervous, but some people are really good at hiding those things. And it doesn't mean that they're not feeling them, right? So it's not always observable. Or think about someone who hears voices, right? We certainly cannot observe that. You might be able to observe them talking back to the voices, but you can't hear what they are experiencing themselves, right? So we can't always observe these things. And something to keep in mind, I wouldn't necessarily categorize this as a disadvantage of using this as a measure, but it is something we have to be cautious about is that everyone experiences distress from time to time, right? So this cannot be the only measure of abnormal behavior because we all experience this. And in fact, not all forms of distress are bad for you, right? They're actually adaptive in some cases. They increase your chances of survival. So think about the fight or flight response. You're most certainly under some level of distress when your body is experiencing this response, but it keeps you safe. You need to experience distress in certain situations because adrenaline's going to go through your system, and you are either going to prepare to defend yourself, right, in whatever way you can, or you're going to flee, right? So your body's going to prepare to send, energy to your cells and blood, to your brain and to your muscles to get moving really fast, right? So distress is not always a bad thing and cannot be the only measure for abnormal behavior. And not all pathology causes distress. So, not all disorders are going to cause obvious distress. And they may not even cause distress at all. So, again, just because someone is not experiencing distress does not mean that they're not experiencing some sort of psychological disorder. And finally, it's very difficult to determine the level of stress or distress that is necessary in order to categorize someone as being distressed, right? So the question is okay, well, if someone's experiencing distress, at what point do we say, well, this amount of distress would categorize this as abnormal behavior and it being an issue? It's very difficult to determine that. And of course, the technology we would need to be able to constantly measure levels of distress in an individual is very difficult, right? So that's not something that is typically done. So certainly a measure of abnormal behavior, but not the only one. Another measure we can use is that of impairment. So, people with psychological disorders often experience some sort of impairment in an aspect of their daily life. So, this is what we're talking about when we refer to impairment here is the individual can no longer successfully function in society, right, or in their daily life. And this, of course, can also cause the individual levels of distress, right? Um, so, a student who becomes anxious about sitting in exams, they can't study properly, right? So, they're so anxious that they cannot function successfully. They cannot even study for their exam. A lot of students have test anxiety. This is a thing, especially in more frequent years. We have a lot of students who need to take tests. They cannot take them in like a typical classroom setting. So, they'll have an area set up in a separate room or an office space where they can take the test alone, so they aren't feeling that high level of anxiety that test taking typically gives them. Police officers can experience this, especially if they've had any incident on the job where they've had to defend themselves, or if they've had to use their firearm for the first time. This can cause a lot of anxiety when they're going on the job and they are unable to perform their duties. And you can think about this with any number of individuals, maybe that, are no longer able to function in their job, right? If their job is a high stress job, they may get to a point where They're so impaired that they can no longer even go to work, right? Or hold down a job. But impairment can also do the opposite. It can also cause people to seek help, right? So sometimes impairment is not a bad thing. It might actually sort of motivate the individual to seek out help. So, again, this is definitely something we look for when we're looking at individuals who may have a psychological disorder and are engaging in abnormal behavior. But this is not the only measure. Right. Causing danger to self and others. So, this is another measure of abnormal behavior. So, any behavior that puts the individual or someone else in harm's way is typically considered to be abnormal. So, things like self harm, so like things like cutting, anorexia, bulimia, type of extreme paranoia. This often results in physically attacking others, so that would be considered abnormal behavior. Parents who have an addiction of some kind and they put their children in harm's way. So these are all considered abnormal behaviors. They are causing danger or putting the individual in danger or causing harm to others around them. But again, right, there's a caveat to this as well. Something to think about, which is an issue with this measure, is what about those individuals who enjoy extreme or combat sports? Would we consider their behaviors to be abnormal? Many of you might say no. Okay, some of you might say yes. Some of you might say yes, it is not normal to behave that way. But some of you might say no, that's not abnormal behavior. But why not? Right? Think about it. If we're using harm to yourself or to others as the definition, um, think about these behaviors. Jumping out of an airplane certainly can be a danger to yourself. Now, yes, there are safety precautions, right? There is a parachute, right? You usually jump with an instructor and so on and so forth, but it's still very dangerous, right? People die all the time skydiving. They get hurt all the time skydiving. So it's certainly more dangerous than staying on the ground, right? It's taking an extra risk. You are putting yourself at potential for greater harm. So you can see how this measure can also be problematic when trying to establish what is and isn't considered abnormal behavior and accounting for all of those exceptions. Like I mentioned before, cultural and social influences. Context is important, right? So a behavior that appears inappropriate or abnormal in one context or culture may not actually be considered appropriate or even unexpected in another culture, right? So I gave the example of a thumbs up. Another behavior, when I was in my graduate program, we had a student in our lab who was from Russia. And I remember she and I were having a conversation one day about smiling. And in her culture, individuals who smile all the time or who walk around smiling are individuals who are mentally impaired. Okay, so they have some sort of intellectual disability. So she says, you know, quote unquote, normal people don't walk around smiling. So when she came to America, it was very odd for her because, you know, when anytime someone passes you anywhere, in the grocery store or if you see someone that you haven't seen for a while, like everyone smiles at each other, right? Especially if you know the person. But she says, no, even with people you're familiar with, even with your family or people you have a close relationship, you don't just smile at each other. That's not something they do. And so that behavior was super abnormal to her. She thought it was, she still, I still know her. She still thinks it's very, very strange. She doesn't smile very often. It's very rare. She is smiling more than when she first moved here, but she says it still feels very strange, very abnormal. It's not a behavior that you would typically engage in her culture. So, context and culture is really important when determining um, whether or not a behavior is normal or abnormal. And something else to keep in mind is that social norms change all the time, right? Think about homosexuality. That was classified as a psychological disorder in the DSM until 1987, right? Thank goodness it was removed. But it was considered a psychological disorder for a long time. There, of course, were treatments for this. Um, Many which were unethical treatments. I mentioned that earlier in the semester when we talked about the ethical code in psychology. So, this behavior was considered to be an abnormal behavior. And now, fast forward 30 years, 40 years, of course, it's a normal behavior, right? It's not considered to be abnormal, at least to the larger society. Of course, there are some exceptions and people would say this isn't normal behavior, but I think in the thinking of the larger society, we now consider this a normal behavior, and certainly in the medical community, right? This is no longer a behavior that is included in the DSM. It's not a psychological disorder, and we don't look at it that way anymore. So that's also something to keep in mind is that social norms do change over time. So, behavior that might be considered normal today or abnormal today may not be considered that way in the future. So, just a fun kind of example if you only saw this small picture here, right? You saw this person's face, no other context. You might say that painting your face this way and yelling this way is abnormal behavior. But when you see the larger context of the photo, now that behavior doesn't seem so abnormal, right? He's at a football game cheering on his team. Everyone paints their face and dresses up oddly and wears lucky shirts and screams with all the fans, right? Because of the context, this is important. It's the same thing when we're looking at culture. You cannot look at a behavior in isolation. You have to look at that behavior within the larger context, within the culture that that individual um, has been raised in. Just another same thing. Again, if you only saw this portion of the picture, so a man, he's singing in what looks like to be his underwear and nothing else, we'd probably say this is abnormal. But in the larger context, at a street festival, I think this is in New York City, maybe slightly less abnormal. Now, maybe we would still say that's still weird, right? Why are you walking around even at a street festival? But maybe it's not that surprising, right? In New York City, maybe you wouldn't be that surprised to see this behavior occurring, and you wouldn't necessarily say it's abnormal behavior. So, context is important when we're talking about defining these behaviors.